He sat there, frozen. The room was silent, but his heartbeat roared in his ears. On the desk before him, a file. Inside, the unmistakable signature of Camilla. King Charles gripped the arms of his chair, staring at the page as though it might disappear, as though what she had done might somehow unhappen. She had made a decision, one that touched the very heart of Queen Elizabeth's legacy, a legacy Charles had sworn to protect. But Camilla, she had acted alone, and worse, without telling him. In that moment, everything shifted. The quiet understanding they built through decades of scandal, loss, and secrecy crumbled. The betrayal wasn't loud, but it echoed through the halls of the palace. Camilla had crossed a line, and it would cost her everything to the world. It's just furniture, jewels, portraits, a gilded clock passed from monarch to monarch. But inside the palace, those objects are everything. Each one tells a story, not just of royalty, but of sacrifice, of lineage, blood. Every vase, every oil painting, every ceremonial sword, they're part of the crown's memory, and whoever controls them controls the narrative. That's why what Camilla did wasn't just personal. It was political. It was emotional. And above all, it was calculated. Because behind those palace gates, there's a truth the public rarely sees. Even in love, power must be balanced. On paper, King Charles and Queen Camilla were united, smiling at engagements, waving from balconies. But in reality, two separate lives. Charles at Buckingham, the crown's official seat, surrounded by age, tradition, duty. Camilla, meanwhile, preferred Clarence House, quieter, cozier, more hers. They said it was a practical arrangement, but those close to them whispered otherwise. The bond that had once defied scandal, that had survived Diana, tabloids, even the Queen's cold disapproval, was beginning to fray, not with arguments, not with shouting, but with silences, unreturned calls, rescheduled meetings, unspoken frustrations, the kind that settled deep beneath the surface, like cracks in glass. And in the middle of it all came the file, a quiet act, signed behind closed doors. But inside the palace, power isn't seized with armies. It's done with paperwork, with the stroke of a pen. Camilla had moved something she didn't own. Not really, not legally, but something with deep symbolic weight. Something Charles had promised to protect. And she had done it alone. This wasn't just about a room being emptied. This was about influence, legacy. It wasn't supposed to be her, not in the eyes of the public, not after Diana. For years, Camilla was a shadow, the scandal, the whispered name behind every tear-streaked photo of the people's princess. When Diana died, the grief was seismic, and the blame, it fell quietly but powerfully on Charles and Camilla. But love, the kind that weathers headlines and heartbreak, doesn't vanish. Charles held on, and so did she. It took time, years of waiting in the wings, a marriage that came not with cheers, but with murmurs of disapproval. Camilla was never meant to be queen, and yet she became one, not through force, but through patience, through a quiet, measured climb that went almost unnoticed. She was always portrayed as the supportive one, the companion. But behind palace doors, Camilla was building something of her own court, her own alliances, her own subtle but unmistakable influence. And Charles? He let her, because theirs was a bond built on decades of shared struggle. Late-night phone calls, private letters, a love hidden, then hated, then finally tolerated. But underneath all that, trust, deep, complicated trust, the kind that's forged in fire. Charles saw Camilla not just as his wife, but as his ally. And above them both, always, was Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, a woman of unshakable tradition. Her values, restraint, order, duty. Her monarchy, sacred. She had reservations about Camilla. Everyone knew it. But for Charles's sake, for the line of succession, She gave her blessing, a reluctant one, but it mattered, and with that blessing came responsibility. Charles promised to preserve, to protect, to honor the traditions his mother had fought to uphold. It was never spoken outright, but understood between them. The crown would remain untouched, its symbols, its rituals, its legacy sacred. And for years, Camilla followed suit, publicly modest, privately diplomatic, until something shifted. Maybe it was the weight of her new title. Maybe it was ambition, long restrained, finally rising. Or maybe she just wanted her legacy to stand next to his, not behind it. Whatever it was, it changed her, and with one act, that quiet trust they'd built, the kind forged over a lifetime, began to unravel. The morning began like any other, gray skies over London, a slow, steady drizzle misting the windows of Buckingham Palace. Inside, the halls were silent, not with peace, but with preparation. Meetings, briefings, sign-offs, the daily business of a monarchy. But in the king's private study, something different was waiting. A red folder, thick, sealed, marked urgent. Charles walked in, tea in hand, eyes heavy from another restless night. He wasn't expecting drama. Not today. He broke the seal, opened the file, and began to read. Line by line, his brow furrowed, then froze. The text was clinical, legal, official, but unmistakable in its meaning. An inventory list, a series of approvals, authorizations. The Queen's things, his mother's things, were being moved, reallocated, removed from storage, reassigned to other residences. Paintings, porcelain from Balmoral, a writing desk Elizabeth used at Windsor, family photographs, handwritten notes. One item stopped him cold, a brooch, emerald and diamond, worn by Elizabeth at his christening. It had always been meant for Charlotte, his granddaughter. Elizabeth had whispered it to him once, late in her reign, keep it safe for her. And now it was gone, moved, reassigned, signed off, by Camilla, and Camilla alone. No consultation, no discussion, just her signature. Charles blinked, as if somehow he'd misread it, as if her name might vanish if he looked away. But it was there, in blue ink, precise, deliberate, a name that once brought him comfort now stared back at him, like a stranger's. The study felt colder, the rain outside heavier. His mind raced, back to those private moments with his mother, the conversations no one else heard, the promises made. He had vowed to protect her legacy, to honor her memory, to guard the spirit of the crown, not just its rules. But now, that spirit had been disturbed, without warning, without consent, and by the one person he thought he could trust. He closed the folder, stared at nothing. The silence around him was deafening, not from a lack of sound, but from a lack of sense. Why had she done it? Why now? It wasn't just about the objects. It was about what they meant. They weren't hers to move. They weren't anyone's. They belonged to the memory of a queen, to history, to continuity. And now they'd been shuffled like office supplies, repackaged, redefined. His hands tightened, not in rage, but in hurt, a kind of hurt only family can inflict, deep, quiet, slow burning. He thought of Camilla, her laugh in the garden, her voice beside him through years of scandal. Had it all meant less to her than it had to him? Or had he simply never seen her clearly? She had acted as queen, but not as a partner, not as his ally. And now the balance between them, the delicate, invisible line they had tiptoed along for years. A royal courier. His Majesty requests your presence at Buckingham this evening. No explanation, no agenda, just a time, 6:45 p.m. Back at the palace, the mood shifted. The air itself seemed heavier. Corridors once filled with idle chatter fell into cautious silence. Staff whispered. Doors closed more gently. They didn't know what had happened. Not exactly, but they knew it was serious. Something had cracked. Camilla remained unaware, at least on the surface. She continued her day as planned, a luncheon, a call with Charity, a short walk with the dogs. But even she could feel it, a strange stillness creeping in, a quiet that pressed against the windows. At dusk, a black car pulled into Buckingham's courtyard. The sky behind her was the color of old stone. She entered through the side entrance, not the main one. The staff barely met her eyes. Charles was already waiting, standing, not sitting, hands behind his back. He didn't offer tea, didn't smile, didn't speak. The door shut behind her with a final sounding click, and for a long moment, they simply stood there, no one else in the room, just them. Then, finally, one word, one question. Why? Camilla blinked, not with guilt, but with confusion. She stepped forward cautiously. I thought it would be better that way, she said softly, to bring her memory to light, to make her legacy more visible for the public. Charles didn't move, didn't nod, didn't speak. She continued. It was about efficiency, consolidating the old holdings, giving some of it to the royal collection, some to Windsor. But he raised his hand, a small gesture, but it stopped her cold. You did it without me, he said, not loud, but sharp, a blade in the air. That was the moment. The crack between them split wide open. Years of partnership, of patience, discretion, survival, suddenly laid bare. I wasn't trying to, Camilla started, but Charles was already shaking his head. You didn't even ask, he said, voice thick now. This wasn't a luncheon guest list. This was her. My mother. Camilla's eyes fell to the floor, but it was too late for silence, too late for diplomacy. I trusted you, he said, and you used that trust to move pieces of a legacy that wasn't yours to touch. There was no yelling, no grand gestures, just quiet devastation. Camilla stepped forward. Charles, please. But he stepped back. Once, twice, and then the words. Final, inevitable, *:_. You'll leave Buckingham. *. She froze, tried to speak, but couldn't. You'll remain queen in title, but you'll remove yourself from the crown's daily affairs. No more signatures. No more private authorizations. His voice was even, his face unreadable, but his eyes held pain. It's not about the brooch, or the paintings, or the desk, he said. It's about us. It's about trust. Camilla didn't fight. There was nothing left to say. She turned slowly, walking toward the door. Not a queen, not a consort, just a woman, leaving a room she was no longer welcome in. And as the door shut behind her, Charles stood alone, in silence. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier. No statement was issued. No photos were pulled. No headlines broke the silence. To the public, nothing had changed. Queen Camilla continued to appear beside Charles at state events, garden parties, and charity galas. The smiles were measured, the waves perfectly timed. But behind closed doors, the shift was undeniable. Clarence House, once a secondary residence, became her full-time refuge. She didn't return to Buckingham, not to live, not to stay. Inside the palace, whispers multiplied, chatter in corridors. Glances exchanged between long-serving staff. Some blamed Camilla, said she overreached, tried to reshape a legacy that wasn't hers. Others, more cautiously, questioned the king's response. Was it grief that spoke, or guilt? Charles, meanwhile, retreated further into protocol. Meetings became stricter, paperwork more meticulous. He began quietly requesting every document Camilla had previously signed over the past year. Not to punish, but to understand, to see what he'd missed. He wasn't angry, not anymore, but something inside him had changed, solidified. He tightened his grip, not out of ego, but out of duty. If his mother's legacy had been vulnerable once, he would not let it happen again. And with that came a quiet shift of power, Advisors who had once split their time between the king and queen now aligned clearly with Charles. Private secretaries reassigned. Rooms once shared, quietly locked. Camilla kept her schedule. She smiled where expected, but she no longer lingered after events, no longer joined planning meetings. The monarchy, always a machine of tradition and timing, continued on. But inside its gears, something had been fundamentally rewired. And Charles, he felt it most. For all his titles, his crowns, his authority, he felt alone. One evening, just past midnight, he sat in his private study. The folder was still on his desk, still unopened since that night. Instead, he reached for a pen and wrote. The recipient remains unknown. Perhaps William, perhaps an old friend, perhaps no one but the paper itself. But the words were real, heavy, personal. I am beginning to learn that grief doesn't always arrive in black. Sometimes it comes dressed in silence, sometimes in signatures. I do not hate her. I never could. But something is broken, something I thought we had built strong enough to survive anything. I wonder what my mother would have done. I wonder if I ever truly understood the weight she carried. He folded the letter carefully, placed it inside a drawer, and said nothing more. To the world, he was still the king, still composed, still smiling. But some progress? For Charles, the answer was never simple. He grew up in the long shadow of a queen who reigned with restraint, duty, and silence. He inherited a legacy that demanded preservation, not reinvention. And yet, he married a woman who had never played by the old rules. Camilla was not the picture of a royal consort. She didn't pretend to be. She had always walked her own quiet path, careful, composed, but not passive, not without intention. So was what she did an act of betrayal, or a misunderstood gesture of modernization? Perhaps, in her own way, Camilla believed she was honoring the queen by giving her legacy to the people, by making the private public. But the monarchy doesn't run on logic. It runs on memory, on feeling. And for Charles, it felt like a line had been crossed, not with malice, but without trust. 1 week later, he made an unannounced visit to Windsor. No cameras, no entourage, just him. He walked the long corridor alone. No guards at his side, just a quiet echo of his steps on marble. And there, at the end of the gallery, hung the portrait, her eyes soft but firm, the unmistakable presence of Queen Elizabeth II. Charles stood in front of it for a long time, hands folded, head bowed. He said nothing for minutes. Then, finally, he whispered something, too quiet to be heard, meant only for her. A son, a successor, a man still asking for guidance. And as he turned to leave, the light through the stained glass caught his crown, not the one of gold, but the invisible one, Burden. Back at Buckingham, the palace remained lit from within. Night had fallen over London, but in the king's study, a single lamp burned through the darkness. Papers still stacked, a letter still tucked away, a man still trying to lead a kingdom, while quietly mending a heart. In a family bound by duty, can love survive betrayal? That question, perhaps, will never have a royal answer, only human ones.